Good afternoon. I'm Anna Marie Francois, the Executive Director of UCLA Center X, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our Zoom webinar this afternoon. Schools in light of COVID-19. The issue is equity. Here at the UCLA Graduate School of Education and Information Studies, our work lives at the intersection of scholarly research, transformative practice, and justice. As such, much of our work is focused on the inequities that confront low-income students of color and in efforts to improve opportunities for learning and access to racial, economic, and social justice. From our work at UCLA Center X to prepare and support educators to succeed with students in urban schools, to efforts of our UCLA community schools in Koreatown and South Los Angeles to transform schools and create new opportunities for learning, we are intently focused on equity. And so, as you might imagine, as the COVID-19 pandemic has played out with harsh impact on the most vulnerable among us, we have grown increasingly concerned, which is why we were so pleased to see the Los Angeles Times so intently focus their reporting on the disproportionate impact COVID-19 has had on low-income students and their families, and to shine a light on the differences for students in more affluent communities. It is tremendously important work we should all be concerned with. There is a saying that journalism is the first draft of history. Perhaps it is also the first draft of research. And so we are tremendously pleased to join tonight with journalists from the LA Times in a discussion of that first draft, their reporting of how the COVID pandemic is impacting students and their families and the implications for learning and opportunity. Our hope is the conversation will enhance our understanding of what is happening and hopefully generate some new ideas about how we're going to come together to do something about it. Do something about it now, do something about it in the future. And so without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce and welcome tonight's moderator, LA Times columnist, Sandy Banks. Sandy cut her teeth, as they say, at the LA Times covering education in Los Angeles and has also been an editorial writer for the. As a columnist, she engages our community in a conversation that adds insight into what is happening in our city and how it impacts the lives of the people who live here. We could not have a better person to lead us in tonight's dialogue. Welcome, Sandy. The mic is yours.
Now the mic is mine. Okay, thank you all. It's an honor to be here, and I'm so very proud of the work that the Los Angeles Times has done, both as an former education reporter and editor, and as the mother of 3 children, and as the mother of a school teacher. It's really important work, and they are elevating issues that we have always thought about, equity, in terms of a new era that is bringing new challenges. I want to introduce you to them all, and we'll be hearing from them over the next hour. First, we have Howard Bloom. Howard was a colleague of mine at the Times. He is a veteran education reporter and an award-winning investigative reporter who is both feared and respected and admired by the forces in education in this city. And he was recently named the Print Journalist of the Year by the LA Press Club. And we are very glad to have him talk from his long experience. His partner in this coverage has been Paloma Esquivel, and she is a longtime reporter at the Times, known as one of the toughest and gentlest reporters at the Times, and a great writer. And she's new to the education team, but she brings fresh eyes, curiosity, and her own experiences as a parent. So we're going to talk about how she's done what she's done and what she's learned. We are very lucky to have Deborah Duardo with us. She is the LA County Superintendent of Schools for the last 4 years. That's a job that has more moving parts than I can even imagine. And it covers issues in school districts that are as different in resources and demographics as Manhattan Beach and El Monte. And she deals with them from her own perspective as a student for many years who worked really hard to get where she is, and we're very lucky to have her. And finally, we have Tyrone Howard. He is a professor of education at UCLA, and he is known for his commitment and his research into the situations of low-income students, students of color, families of color, and what resources are in those communities that we can tap to help overcome some of the problems and close the equity gap. So we're going to start first talking to Howard from his long experience. And Howard knows, and I know, that equity has been an issue in education for decades. We've spoken about it over the years, we've written about it. This is a new level of equity issues because now your very access to education in the era of COVID depends on skills and resources that are not evenly distributed. And I want to start by just asking Howard, given what you've seen over the years, what do you think is at stake now that hasn't been before? Howard?
Yes, well, what we found in story after story is that the coronavirus pandemic has exposed existing inequities and made them worse. So, for example, it's always been true that lower income families lacked adequate computers and adequate broadband at home. And to some degree, this deficit was always hindering students in these families, but at least they could attend classes on campus where schools and teachers could try to compensate for these disadvantages. But once the pandemic hit, the entire possibility for learning hinged on technology, and they did not have what they needed. Many families also cannot provide a conducive learning environment within their home. It's too crowded or too noisy or whatever, but that real and existing problem mattered less when there was a campus to go to. And every age of child has the unique challenges. Younger children lack technical skills on computers or attention spans for computer work. Older children have to babysit or take jobs to support the family. Students also lost motivation, and yet they were effectively beyond the reach of counselors who could have provided help. We don't know the exact numbers, but we had to conclude that for an astonishing percentage of children, the spring semester from March onward became a lost semester, and not all the problems have been addressed even now. LA Unified did an internal review, which it kept mostly quiet about, but the study found that more than 50,000 Black and Latino middle and high school students in Los Angeles did not regularly participate in the school system's main platform for virtual classrooms after campuses closed in March. Now, things are much better now, although the data is difficult to interpret and it hasn't been completely released in anything that would allow, in any form that would allow us to do a real analysis. But what we found from the spring is that nearly every category of students sorted by race, income, learning needs included large numbers who did not regularly participate in distance learning. And low income and Black and Latino students showed participation rates between 10 and 20 percentage points lower than their white and Asian peers. And we found a similar picture for English learners, students with disabilities, homeless students, and those in the foster care system. So serious problems, but I'll stop there for now.
Were you able to quantify the reasons and categorize reasons why they were not online and what the problems were?
Well, we certainly were able to list the reasons. As far as quantifying what affected people in different areas at different times, it's difficult because that kind of data was not collected in any scientific way. But it's everything that has been talked about so far and which we'll continue to go into. It's learning conditions at home, it's the technology, it's the family struggles. For example, again, everything was hitting the people who had the most issues. So the same families that lacked technology, they also had poorer learning conditions at home. The home was crowded. They had parents who had to work, so they couldn't supervise. Those families were more likely to have COVID invade their families. They were more likely to have deaths. So it was basically all these things that constituted a divide. There were new factors as well as exacerbating of existing factors. And it's pretty much everything you could think of that would pertain to this situation.
One last thing, just to draw on your experience. I know we could not have anticipated this, but is the failure, we've been in the technology age for a long time, and we know that LA Unified dealt with giving iPads to everybody and all. Is the failure to equip students with devices like this our failure as a public? And is that something that we should have considered more seriously before this and found ways to do it?
Well, yes and no. I mean, once the pandemic hit, there was a public policy imperative to move quickly and to move heaven and earth, if necessary, to make sure that all students had computer and internet, and that did not happen. So that was a policy failure. It was also a funding failure. It was a supply chain failure. And there were people who were working very hard. I mean, one of them is on this panel, Deborah Duardo, Tyrone Howard, who is also on this panel. He was doing everything he could think of to help, and we were doing everything we could think of to expose it. Now, LA Unified's use of computers was not necessarily disastrous before the pandemic. They did not have enough computers to send a computer home with everybody, but they did have computers on campus, and they would move these computers around. Because you know, on campus, you're not on a computer all the time. You're on a computer part of the time. I mean, if you were on the computer all the time, that would be a problem too. And they generally had computers available in most campuses when they needed them, but they did not, like, they would have a classroom set of computers and students would move from class to class. So every student had a sign-on, but they didn't necessarily have their own computer. So as long as they had access to a computer when they needed it, that kind of worked. It may not have been ideal, but it sort of worked. But the minute you send everybody home, then everybody needs their own computer. So the pandemic created unique challenges. And as I said, it exposed problems that were there all along.
Moving to Paloma, you spend a lot of time talking to people, talking to parents and children and teachers and in homes. What have you found that surprised you, particularly, you know, digging into education for the first time?
Yeah, it's interesting because I started covering education in about March. So my introduction to this was sort of the immediate closure of schools and a bit of a scramble to figure out what that meant, right? Initially, we thought it was like sort of a short-term thing, and then sort of seeing it go on and trying to sort of grapple with what does this actually mean for students. And I think that for me, early on, I remember in April, I went out to do a profile of a teacher in Inglewood at a middle school in Inglewood. And I kept calling her to talk about like how she was doing her online classes, how it was working out. How do you teach math on, you know, online? And she kept saying, I can't talk, I have to go to school and distribute food. And like every time I would call her, it was like, no, I'm sorry, like I'll call you later, I have to go distribute food. And I think for me, like when, and I eventually went to the campus and to sort of follow her around, and just saw this long line of parents that were lined up to pick up food, and I started talking to them, and every single one of them was talking about having lost a job. And so it really, really sort of hit me in that moment. It's like, we're talking about the mechanics of distance learning, and does the kid have a computer, you know, is there internet access? And a lot of these families are in this moment thinking about survival. And how do we sort of, I think in that moment really hit me how big what this moment was and what was happening, and the real sort of lasting impact that it's going to have on kids and families. And it, I think, made me just think, you know, a lot less about like what are the sort of bureaucratic responses to this, and how are people really living this experience in their homes with their families, trying to one, just make it day to day, and then two, make sure that their kids continue with some kind of education where they can.
What kind of response have you gotten from the public? Because, you know, we all are struggling with some issues because of COVID, and overwhelmed many people. Is the equity issue, the broad equity issue, resonating, and particularly in this time of voices being heard that haven't conventionally been heard? You know, what are you hearing in terms of, are people saying, wow, this is not acceptable, or not?
I think there are people saying, wow, this is not acceptable. And there are also people saying, why focus so much on that issue? Because, you know, every family is struggling. Every family has issues. It doesn't matter if you have resources. And to some extent, that's true, right? Even if you have some kind of support or resources, you speak English, even if you have those things, it's an incredible challenge to try to educate kids from home. It's really hard and taxing, but it's not the same as what a lot of Black students are facing, what a lot of Latino students are facing, what a lot of families without money are facing. So I do think there's some response that sort of recognizes that inequity and that sense that we really have to sort of change the way we do things in order to fix some of these issues. But there's also a lot of folks who are concerned about their own families and their own opportunities for their kids.
Thank you. And Deborah, you're sitting in a position of being part of the organization that can kind of do something about this in terms of, or at least monitor it. What do you think about, I know COVID has hit communities of color far more deeply than it has other communities. Do you see that as interacting with the educational equity issues and access issues? And how are you able to address that across the broad range of schools that you oversee?
Thank you, Sandy. Absolutely. You know, there's no question that this pandemic is impacting children differently. And our children that are in poverty and disproportionately Black and Latino are really feeling the pain of this pandemic. And it's just putting a spotlight on existing inequities that have been there for a very long time. You know, Paloma mentioned the fact that initially it was making sure our families were fed. Districts have been providing meals to families and not asking, like, not just for the children, for the parents and the tias and abuelos and, you know, other members in the household to make sure that they're being fed. One of the things that we realized very early on is that families and communities relied on school in a very critical way, and not just for their instruction, but as was mentioned previously, to get resources, to get supports. For some families and children, school was the safest place you can be and kind of get out of your world and get support for whatever you needed. So initially it was making sure that everybody had food and that everybody was safe and that we could connect with our children and families to see what their needs were. But then we had to make sure that they had devices and that they had access to the internet. And that was a challenge because we saw that it was predominantly our poor Latino, African-American children that didn't have access to those devices. And as Howard said, part of it was finding the funding to buy those resources, but a lot of it was these devices were on back order. It was difficult to get right away. And then it was the challenge of what was going on in the household. Who was there for those children whose parents were primarily essential workers supporting their children in their instruction at home? And how were we reaching out and making sure that they had access to everything that they needed to be able to learn? And also at the same time, just meeting the emotional needs. You know, this is a time when everybody, whether you're an adult or a child, are feeling a lot of emotional stress. And, you know, we're seeing an increase in suicidal ideation. We're seeing an increase of people having anxiety disorders, people not being able to focus. So we really needed to do a lot to make sure, one, that our children were safe, that they were being fed, that they had the devices that they needed, that our teachers had the devices and the equipment that they needed, and to train everybody to learn in a way that they've never had to learn before, and that was through distance learning.
I'm going to get to Tyrone because he's going to help us look at solutions, and then we're going to open it up for questions. But I just want to raise the issue, and we can have conversation about this too. You know, we know that there are families that are affluent or that are, you know, middle class that are able to kind of bypass some of these issues. We've heard of families organizing in pods and you know, families hiring tutors to sit with their children during the online classes and all that. And yet we have on the other end, children who are basically home alone, or as you say, grandma's trying to do it and she's not on there. And this raises the question of whether children are going to fall off in ways that they can't climb back up very easily, especially if there are some kids that are moving forward, at the same pace, and other students who are not. And so, Tyrone, I know you've studied a lot of community issues and family issues, and with your work with the Pritzker Center to support the strengthening of children and families. What do you see going forward, and what do you see that we ought to be doing that maybe we're not right now to help? I don't want to say close the equity gap, because in 30 years we've talked about this forever, and it's a really difficult problem. But what do you see that can give us hope and and give these families support?
No, I think one of the things that's oftentimes been frustrating for me as I've studied this topic for several decades now is that individuals would frequently say, well, this is not about government or about structures. This is about people's choices. This is about people's motivation. And you give data and you give data and you give data, and folks will still refute it. I think we're living in a moment right now that is, to me, exhibit A of what structural inequality looks like, because this pandemic has exposed it. And I've said this multiple times before. I don't begrudge the fact that families have the means to provide for their children by having learning pods and professional tutors and private tutors paying them large sums of money. I just begrudge the fact that we have a system that allows it to happen, sees it happening, and knowing that we're going to pay a significant price when we see large numbers of our students who are on the outside looking in when it comes to their academic achievements, as well as the social emotional concerns that Dr. Duardo raised. So what needs to happen? What can be helpful or hopeful for us? I think we have to go back to the example we saw with regard to how we responded to the need that families had with food. When families needed food, what happened, we saw a number of public-private partnerships that came together to say, we're going to feed families. I think that's the same thing we have to do now. We are in Los Angeles, California. It is the philanthropic capital of our nation. This is where we need private philanthropic organizations working with public entities, working with elected officials, with faith-based organizations, working with universities, working with community-based organizations. It's going to require a collective effort with an emphasis being placed on those who are most vulnerable. So for example, even here at the Pritzker Center, what we asked was UCLA students if they'd be willing to volunteer to give just an hour a week to help tutoring some of our students and caregivers who are having difficulty in this time. We had 500 students who just volunteered their time to give an hour a week to help out. It's those kinds of efforts that are going to have to be a staple in how we recover in this moment. Moreover, I think what we're going to also have to do is find ways to get more private investment to ensure that we give pods and learning opportunities for those children who need them. But I'm also concerned too, if I can, Sandy, about the adults who are at home helping children, because we have lots of adults who are also struggling, frustrated, tired, feeling anxiety, feeling pressure, feeling depressed. So the support obviously has to go for our students, number one, but also there needs to be adult support as well. And I think that gets lost in our conversation. Same thing with our schools. We put a lot of focus, as we should, on the needs of our students, but I'm talking to far too many teachers who are feeling stressed, who are feeling overworked, who are feeling overwhelmed, who are feeling under-supported. So as we think about supports, as we think about interventions, as we think about collective ways that we support those, I just ask us not to neglect the needs of our adults in this moment, because we know our children will only be as strong as the adult support systems that they have at home.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because that is something that we see. I know I see it in my daughter, and I see it in the parents who are literally sometimes breaking down, right before your eyes with the demands that are put on them, and there is no support. How do you, kudos for the program at UCLA, because that sounds wonderful both for the students and for the people that they volunteer with. How does that spread? I mean, have you been able to talk that up somewhere, or other universities thinking of doing this, or how do we grow something like that?
I think what happens in our city, we get very competitive about our sports UCLA versus USC, Lakers versus Clippers, Rams versus whomever. I think we need to use that same competitive spirit in terms of who is doing these kinds of efforts. So I think we need to lay down the challenge to other universities and other organizations across our county to say, here's what we're doing. We want to challenge you to see how many families you can reach. We want to challenge you to see how many children you can reach. We want to challenge you to see how much money you can raise. There are too many resources right here in the county of Los Angeles for us to have the widespread inequities that exist. I think it's a matter of just being willing to recognize that people are willing to give their time or their talent, or in some cases, their resources. I think we've got to spread the word. But I think as we do this work, though, Sandy, I think we have to think about what are those areas that have the greatest needs. So much of our work with regard to the tutor center, the tutor network, has been in the Antelope Valley, which Dr. Eduardo knows and we all know is one of our most overlooked and underserved areas where the rates of foster youth are incredibly high, the number of homeless families is incredibly high. We have to help those families where we see the need is greatest, because I do believe in the idea that rising tides lift all boats. If we go to where those needs are most great, I think we can start to see how we can slowly turn the tide. But if we don't, I think we're going to rue the day that we did not take a more proactive step to help our most vulnerable families and children at this time.
I think you're right. And when you talk about investing in them and sending people, that also sends a message that somebody cares. Mm-hmm. And that alone is empowering and uplifting for the students.
I could add to that conversation. I'd also want to say that throughout the county, we have a community schools initiative, which is basically saying, let's make sure that schools are the hub of our community services, that we bring all of the county departments together to provide services at schools or in schools communities. We have a strong partnership with UCLA, the Department of Mental Health, the Department of Children and Family Services. All of us have been working together to make sure through philanthropy and through the support of the Board of Supervisors that we are leveraging resources and saying, a school district cannot do this work alone. It's going to require partnerships with nonprofit organizations, with the departments, with philanthropy, to make sure that we are making our children and their families a priority.
Howard, you've seen schools operating a long time, and I know there have been groups like LA Partnership and, whatever, the Mayor's Council for Schools. Are you seeing a lot of that happening now, or are those groups kind of just off to the side? First question. And then I want to know about charter schools. Are they any different from the rest of the schools and how they're managing this and equity issues there?
Well, I think that a lot of people really are trying to step up, but I'd like to see the LA area prove that it is indeed the philanthropic center of the nation, because I think there's a lot of untapped wealth. And some of this has to do with a lot of the industrial and corporate base moving out of LA. There used to be a more organized structure for philanthropy, even though it was filled with structural racism. But putting that aside, we have a very disparate, disorganized metropolis. I mean, that is Los Angeles. That's the Los Angeles that you and I have been covering for decades. And I think Tyrone in his way and Deborah in her way are trying to make a community of a disconnected place, and they are succeeding as best they can. But there's a lot more that can be done. And it's really hard to do. I think there's a long ways to go. And I also worry that people tune it out after a while, because it's like the first time Donald Trump says something that turns out to not to be true, we're like aghast. And then 1,000 times later, it just, we don't not even paying attention anymore. And sadly, I think the same thing happens in stories of inequity and poverty, and that it's a challenge for us to tell the story in fresh and compelling ways so that people continue to pay attention and do something about it. So it is one of the challenges, the great challenges of our time, to actually look hard at what needs to be done and actually work together to do it. It is the story of our time and maybe of all times.
I have to say, I think you are doing a wonderful job, though, in personalizing, because you're right. People tune out when they hear about equity. It's too big. What are they going to do about it? But there's not a story of yours I've read that hasn't had some character that stayed with me. Some poor kid, who wanted to wear his new shoes to school, or, so many stories. And I wonder if there are PSAs or things we could do to make clear this is not, it's a mega issue, but it's also a very personal issue that's affecting these kids and these families. And I don't know, in your reporting, I know Paloma, you've encountered those people, like that mother that you talked about. Is there a way to make this a story that all of Los Angeles will care about, even if their kids are doing fine?
That's a really good question. If I knew the answer to that question, I think we try really, really hard in our reporting to do that, right? To put a face on these stories and to talk to parents and children and teachers, and really draw out their stories so that people can relate to them and see them and see what they're dealing with. But I don't know the sort of magic
Darn it.
magic bullet there.
I'd like to add something here. I feel that it's important for school districts and leaders to be willing to expose themselves to potential criticism, because many leaders are in this awkward position of wanting to really say how awful things are going, but they don't want to risk being blamed for it. And so instead they say something to the effect of, we're doing great and everything's fine. You know, everybody's got computers, everybody's got hotspot, and kids are learning well because of our efforts. But by the way, we still need more money for ongoing issues that we'd rather not describe. And they just have to not do that and say, actually, things are not going well in a lot of places. And we are working hard, but a lot of times we're actually not succeeding. And please don't blame us for it. Instead, help us. And if you can give us constructive criticism, we're adult enough to accept that as well.
That ties right into a question that we have from an attendee here to the webinar. And they ask, how can principals get support too, so that they can remain or grow as effective leaders and supporters of their teachers, students, and families? Is there a network for principals right now? And I mean, I don't know if you know that, Howard, from LA Unified, or Deborah, if there are any efforts, because this must be really challenging for principals, you know, as those leaders. What are we doing or can we do for them?
Deborah, you take that one.
You know, in LA County, we have 80 school districts. And one of the things that the LA County Office of Education does is it provides professional development and leadership opportunity and support to all of those 80 districts. Some are targeted towards counselors and helping them assess safety during COVID. We have specific programs for principals. We have leadership support for the superintendents. So there is plenty of opportunities. You know, you should find out what's going on in your district. And if you feel free to contact the LA County Office of Education, we provide resources to all of our superintendents. But I also just wanted to say that I think our office was very clear that we had a challenge, a real challenge with devices. And that's why we went to the Board of Supervisors and said, you know, we have a shortage of over 27,000 devices in LA County, and, you know, thousands and thousands of hotspot and internet needs. We went to the Board of Supervisors and they gave us $12.8 million to help meet that need. So I think we're open to saying we cannot do this alone. We need to get the support, not only from our Board of Supervisors, but also from the general public, from the, you know, network providers. We need people to step up and come in and start supporting our schools.
If I can chime in to build on that, I'm glad someone asked about principals, and I'm going to give a shameless plug to our Principal Leadership Institute at UCLA, where Nancy Pieracchini has done an amazing job to ensure that principals still get support. And that's important in this moment. But I appreciate something Howard just said. I think part of it is going to require courageous leadership at this moment. And that courageous leadership is around recognizing the fact that we need help, to say we need help. To be willing to even criticize what has not happened at the board level, to criticize what has not happened at the city level, to be able to identify what the specific needs are. I talked to a principal just last week, and he said, at this point in time, I just need more supports from my teachers, because my teachers are just stretched again, emotionally, physically, and everything else. So I think we need to find spaces where principals can come together to talk to one another, support each other, to let them know that they're not in it alone. That's the number one thing I hear principals saying, that I just need to commiserate with other people who understand that I'm being pulled in 10 different directions, being asked to do 20 different things, all by the end of the day. And so that needs to be taken into consideration.
That's a really good point. We hear that a lot. We have a question now from an attendee talking about students. What school-based supports need to be implemented or strengthened to make the transition back to in-person successful, particularly for low-income Black and Latino youth? And I suspect they're, you know, referring to the fact that they will probably be behind, that they will not start back in school learning at the same level as some peers. So who, I don't know, I don't want to keep going to Deborah and going to the well, but what do you think? I guess, Tyrone, you also work in communities. What do they need? What will we need?
Yeah, I think we need to understand what our children have been through for the past 6 months. I think we need to be patient, forgiving, understanding, compassionate. I still have to remind folks, we are living through a global pandemic. And so for us to come back business as usual, I think would be a huge mistake. The reality is this. I think lots of schools want to move back to business as usual when that happens and focus on the learning loss, which I get. But I still think we've got to recognize the social, emotional challenges that students are facing, the mental health needs that need to be attended to. We are seeing, as Deborah mentioned, the number of students who are experiencing high levels of depression, who are experiencing anxiety. We've seen increases in suicide among Black and brown youth, according to the data from the CDC. I maintain that right now we have to double and triple down the kind of supports around mental health to make sure we have more psychiatric social workers, to make sure we have more therapists, to make sure we have more counselors. If we think we can just go into business as usual to get back to learning right off the bat, I think that's a big, big mistake. I think our kids are still struggling, they're still hurting, they're still suffering. So if we want to make this an equity issue, especially when it comes to Black and brown and poor communities, mental health supports have to be put in place first, then we'll get to the learning. But to think that we can just resume as we were, I think would do a major disservice to our kids who are still trying to figure out what will normal look like. We have young children who are experiencing homelessness. We've seen the rates go up. We've seen evictions go up. We have a lot of our children, we know their caregivers are essential workers. They're concerned about their health and well-being. Our kids are carrying a heavy, heavy emotional load right now, and we cannot focus on learning when we're worried about health and safety and other issues such as where will I sleep tonight? When will I eat next? I think those issues have to be first and foremost prior to us getting into the learning.
Well, we've talked about the grassroots efforts and the philanthropic efforts and you know, local efforts to help. What about the responsibility of government? What about, you know, recognizing the magnitude of this problem and the implications that it can pose for us for decades to come? Do any of you see on the horizon the kind of institutional government awareness of what we're going through and what needs to be done? Can we count on that for help, for vision?
Well, I'm sure Deborah can answer this one as well, but just from what I've seen as a reporter, it's, you know, one of the problems with government is that government is funded by resources, right? And it's also funded to the level of tax rates. And as bad as things are right now, they actually could get worse because, for example, the current state budget is based on the presumption that more money is going to come from the federal level that actually has not come yet. And if that money does not arrive, then school districts are looking at significant budget cuts. So in this time when they're looking to have more resources, both to get their schools ready and to maintain safe conditions and to make up for learning deficits, they may instead have to engage in layoffs and do triage where they acknowledge that things will actually be worse rather than better. So that's a problem. And then of course, we, I mean, one of the blessings and failings of democracy is that it's very diverse in terms of who has authority over what, and it's often hard to get everybody rowing in the same direction. And we certainly don't want to be rowing in an authoritarian way together, but it is hard work. It is hard work. And, you know, from the federal government on down, there's been somewhat of a lack of leadership, although I think there's more of a consistent voice in California, at least, from Governor Newsom on down about the need for resources at schools. So you know, the other thing here is that not everybody agrees on what to do. So, and this is a problem that I know school district, and Deborah is at one level a school district leader because the county operates schools as well, even though it is an advisory function for school districts. that there's a lot of disagreement on when and how schools can be open safely, because everybody knows that things will be better if we can operate schools safely. But if we can't operate schools safely, then where are we? And there are lawsuits filed. There are great disagreements. There was a big to-do at the county level over offering waivers to allow some schools to open. LA Unified has a perspective on when it would be safe to open schools. It's more conservative, but they are also aggressively trying to come up with a testing plan that might allow them to open schools. Long Beach is not going to reopen until January. And there's also an equity issue there. Our research, our stories have indicated that if, for families who live in more prosperous areas, that their schools are more likely to open, more ready to open than school districts that are larger or that serve lower income, higher poverty areas where the COVID-19 has a greater prevalence. So all of those things are complicating the issue of how governments address this.
We have a question that an attendee is directing to Paloma, but anybody can weigh in on this too. And it is, what about accentuating stories of resiliency? How can we spread stories of young people and families that are models and example for other youths and families? And I know as a reporter, we always say, it's not news, when 1,000 kids go to school and learn. It's only news when, they don't. So, but there is something to that it could be encouraging for people to read that, there are ways to kind of at least keep yourself sane during this and succeed. Do you find those stories and do you think that they're worth sharing?
I would say that I think a lot of the stories we've shared about parents and kids are stories of resiliency. And I feel like that is, they're facing these incredible challenges. I remember I talked to the mom of a student in the Coachella Valley who didn't get a computer, for all of the spring semester, just essentially was not able to go to school. But they tried on their cell phone over and over and over again for week after week to try to log on. And when that didn't work, they tried to, they got the paper packets. And when the mom couldn't help explain the work in the paper packets, she tried taking her daughter to her sister's house so that her sister could help explain. And so, I feel like this is an incredibly important moment to still continue to point out the incredible need that's there. But I don't see that as separate from stories of resiliency. It's there in the families and the fact that they're continuing to push forward and continuing to try to get their children an education however possible. So that's sort of how I see it.
And that matters. I think what people are hungry for, and we may not get that, is kind of success, somebody who beat it and who's doing great despite everything. And, that would make us feel better, but the reality in the trenches is not quite there.
Can I respond to that question real quick,
Sure,
Sandy, please, about resiliency?
Yes.
So I love the work you've done over the years, the work Howard and Paloma have done around resiliency, but I guess there's a double-edged sword to that, because the word resiliency bothers me because I want it to disappear, because resiliency is typically in response to something that's not in place. People have to show resiliency in the face of obstacles. They have to show resiliency in the face of structural disadvantage. They have to show resiliency in the face of racism or sexism. They have to show resiliency in the face of historical disadvantage. So, and part of what I oftentimes get worried about is I think while it's important to show people's resourcefulness and how they demonstrate this tenacity to survive, but then the question becomes, well, see, they did it, how come the rest of you all can't do it? And how about we get to the point and get to a place where folks don't have to fight to get a living wage. Folks don't have to fight to find affordable housing. They don't have to fight to find high quality schools. That becomes just the norm. So I so appreciate the work that's being done, but I want us to make sure that the other narrative is in place, that folks only have to demonstrate resilience in the face of lots of adversity. And how do we take the steps to eliminate the adversity and the obstacles as opposed to constantly highlighting the resiliency that people show?
Is there a way that in this era when you know, Black lives are finally mattering and brown lives are finally mattering, that we can tie these equity issues into the greater issue of safety and opportunity and the things that we're talking about as a country now? Tyrone, that's for you. So.
Yeah, so that's the new question. So we can only do that if we're really, really ready to have a racial reckoning, because as Howard has so eloquently stated, these issues are not coincidentally impacting communities of color in a harsh way. So while we know everybody's been affected in some way, shape, or form, until we talk about the long, ugly history in our nation, even here in California, here in Los Angeles, around racial inequities, around racial inequality, we're not going to get there. So yes, they have to be tied. You cannot talk about this moment around COVID. You can talk about it as a public policy issue. You can talk about it as a public health issue. But to me, it's really a moral reckoning around how we talk about race and how we don't talk about race. And our refusal to talk about race only leads us to sort of these dead-end solutions, because at the end of the day, in a city like Los Angeles that has a rich ethnic and racial sort of tapestry, for us to think that everyone starts from the same place, has the same advantages, has the same historical opportunities, is just not what we should be doing. We have to recognize that until we come to grips with the kind of anti-racist legislation that we see coming from the Board of Supervisors, that we're not going to get to the root cause of this. I think that's just window dressing in the interim.
Mm-hmm.
And if I could just add to that, you know, I was part of a committee, the Greater LA Committee, that presented a report. It was in partnership with both USC and UCLA and stakeholders from all sectors of LA, business, housing, education, you name it. And really what the report was saying is that these inequities have existed for a very, very long time. And we don't want to go back to the old way things were handled in LA. We're looking forward to thinking about what we can do differently to be very intentional about addressing systemic racism, and more specifically, anti-Black racism. And we have recommendations in that report that we're all of us sectors are working together with philanthropy, saying we need to use what we're learning in this pandemic, the inequities that are really being highlighted in this pandemic, and making it very clear that this is not because of bad luck or, you know, just people being out. This is because of years and years of systemic racism that we need to address together if we want our children to learn, if we want our families to be whole and safe, that we really need to address this. So I'm really proud to be a part of that, and we're committed to really looking much deeper about the inequities that exist and how we can, you know, move forward to a better, greater LA.
Thank you. We're running closer to the time we're going to end, but and we're getting a lot of questions, so I want to get to some of them. They're really good questions. Thank you, attendees, for challenging us here. One is as the Times continues its coverage of how the pandemic is impacting students and families, what are you interested in reporting on next? What are you seeing that concerns you, and what do you see that is helping? Howard or Paloma? And while they're waiting, I just want to give a great shout out to Stephanie Chavez, who was their editor and also a longtime education reporter who stays up at night thinking about issues of equity and has really been a big force behind our coverage.
Yeah, she keeps me up at night.
I bet she does. But what do you think? What are you looking to next? I mean, now that you have laid the groundwork for us to do the work on equity.
Well, I mean, we are looking at what's changed since the spring. You know, what are the areas of progress? What are the areas where there's still need? We don't want people to forget that this problem hasn't been solved. People are very concerned with school reopenings. And you know, whenever we write about the possibility of schools reopening, our readership metrics go off the chart. And so obviously people want to know, when are we going back? When does this end? And it's a complicated question because people have different perspectives. The science is always evolving. And so is distance learning getting better? What about hybrid learning? What's so great about hybrid learning? There are people who say that if you think distance learning is bad, wait till you get to hybrid learning. And how can there are some districts who are saying, oh, by the way, teachers, we want you to teach distance learning and hybrid learning at the same time. And that may be impossible to do. I would not want to do that as a teacher. And so these are all challenges, as we cross the bridge into this hybrid learning phase where some in-person instruction and some distance instruction comes by, that's going to be a huge story. That's going to be a big one. And what will it take to reopen? We want to follow the LA Unified testing program. Is that really the way out? There are people who think it's just the greatest idea and initiative ever. Other people, it makes no sense to whatsoever.
You mean the COVID testing, not the school testing?
Right, yeah, as opposed to the regular testing we always do. And so those are some things. Paloma, do you want to jump on that?
Yeah, I think I'm really interested in looking at, as we get broader reopenings, do we continue to see the pattern that we saw, that we started to see in Orange County and San Diego, where more affluent schools were able to reopen and schools in lower income districts were not, because of the level of coronavirus still in those communities. So I think that's definitely something I want to be looking toward is, as as especially LA County moves towards more reopening, do we continue to see that pattern, or does something change here? That's an interesting question to me.
I also forgot to answer your question about charter schools earlier. They're in essentially the same situation. And there are some charter schools that have done some creative, innovative things and that are models truly. And then there are other charter schools that just did not have the resources or organization to get it together, and learning virtually shut down at those schools. So it's a range, and charter schools are public schools, so they're facing the same issues that school districts are. One advantage they had is that they were eligible for the PPP loans, and regular school districts were not. And so that's an element of controversy, but there are people who defend that and saying, hey, there are some resources they don't have access to, and they felt if it was money available that they could apply to the mission, they felt they had a right to do it.
And what about students with disabilities? We've had a couple questions about that, and you've written about the particular struggles that they face because online learning is not certainly optimum for them. But are there any specific interventions in the work that you see so that students with disability can have equal access to the tools they need?
Yeah, they need to come back to school is what they need. Now, they can't come back if it's not safe, but I think superintendents are prioritizing this, and there's actually nothing in the law that stops them from bringing back students to school. LA Unified has been among the most cautious of districts, and I'm not criticizing for this. Their position could be completely correct on that front. But LA Unified is trying to get ready next week to bring students back one-on-one. And this would be for tutoring outside. It could involve students with special needs. The unions have been very cautious about this, and I'm not saying they're wrong either. There's research that supports the union's caution. I mean, the last thing a union wants is a dead member because of COVID-19. So they're going to be extra cautious. But the truth is that to help these students, you've really got to bring them back to an in-person situation, and you've got to do it safely. I remember hearing from one teacher who had a special ed preschool students, and I'm sure I've told this before, but the student was literally trying to force his face into the computer monitor to touch the teacher because the child was so desperate for that contact with the teacher. And the teacher was practically crying as she told me this story. So we all know what we need to happen, but I'm not pointing fingers at anybody for why it hasn't. It's a very complicated issue.
Well, if I could add to that, and first of all, I want to say as a mother of a son with a severe disability, I know how challenging it is to support your child when they have special needs. But I'd like to say that until September 14th, the Department of Public Health really didn't allow districts to bring students back in person because of the high rates of COVID. September 14th, they gave us the okay, and schools are bringing in their students with disabilities for assessment and for some instruction, and especially for students who need other services like behavioral support, speech therapy. So students with disabilities and English language learners who are also struggling with distance learning districts are providing services to those students and starting to bring them back to support their learning.
Could there be a possibility then of tiered returns for students who don't have support at home? Their parents are essential workers, or for whatever reason, are there, you know, could that, they're not defined as being disabled or, you know, non-English speaking, but could there be tiered returns?
Right. So the Board of Supervisors just approved of gradually bringing students back. And these are students, our youngest students. So our TK through second grade, not just students with disabilities or English language learners, but really students, and prioritizing students that are Title I schools. So students that are low income, that are really struggling with instruction, will be able to apply for waivers. And if the school has a solid plan in place for how they're going to maintain the safety issues around the Department of Public Health, so the mask wearing, the disinfecting, the maintaining the social distancing, the Department of Public Health is going to start allowing waivers for our youngest students.
Oh, great. We have about 5 minutes left, and we have a resource question from an attendee. That are all the articles that the education team has written at the LA Times, are they available in any specific section on the website, or is there a way maybe to pair those with resources from UCLA so that teachers can create lessons around the issue of access to education and equity issues? And Howard, I hope you know that.
Well, I can give a partial answer to that. It's not going to be the perfect answer. You know, the Times has had an initiative in recent years to reach out to schools and has often provided newspapers free of charge to classrooms. I think we need to do more on that front. And I would actually look forward to finding a way to, when I'm not, you know, working all day long on writing articles, to make the resources of the Times as an education resource more available to students. And I think the Times is very open to that. All of our articles are not typically open to all readers at all times. A lot of the coronavirus coverage has been free of charge, but you know, the truth is newspapers are struggling, and we went for like 6 months with barely an ad in the newspaper, and something has to pay our salaries, and it's essentially readers. So for those with people who do have resources, I would urge you to support the newspaper and to subscribe to it. I mean, I hate to make a shameless pitch like that, but I just feel that the function that newspapers play is so important, and it doesn't happen without reader support. And we appreciate all the support we have. I even appreciate all the hate mail I get every day, because it shows that somebody's reading the stories. So thank you, all you hate mailers out there, and keep on reading. So we need to do more, and there's partnerships that we can do. There is sort of a landing page. If you do subscribe to the Times and you get on, there's often you can usually find the school's landing page, and you can scroll through a lot of our recent work. We could do more. I would like it to do better that way. The metrics show that people don't scroll back that far, to be honest. But I think it would be a great resource for schools and for students. And I'd love it if we did more in that way.
And you can find, if you subscribe, an education tab at the top of the homepage most often, and you could call up their work that way. But it would be great to see UCLA and the Times, you know, collaborate on resources, particularly for teachers who do want to teach about this. And we've heard the stories of teachers who do and get in trouble because they didn't do it the right way or whatever. But it's important. It's important for the students and for the next generation of students to know kind of what they're up against, and, you know, and be prepared for battle, and to advocate. So we are at 1 minute left, and I just want to thank all the panelists. This has been fascinating to me, even as somebody who knows education, and I hope it has been to you attendees. Thank you for joining us. And feel free to reach out, howard.bloom@latimes.com, paloma.esquivel@latimes.com. And I know you can, I think on their bios, you can find Dr. Howard and Dr. Eduardo. So thank you all very much for joining us today, and we hope to do this again.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.